My best man stood up at my wedding and announced, "I can't let you marry her after what I found in her basement." The ballroom went silent, except for the string quartet still playing softly in the corner until someone had the sense to cut them off. 300 guests stopped mid-conversation, champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips, all eyes locked on Trevor standing at the head table with his face red and his hands shaking. My bride Natalie turned to look at me from where she stood near the cake, her white dress catching the light from the chandeliers, her expression cycling through confusion to fear to something I couldn't identify in the half-second before chaos erupted. Trevor's voice came out louder the second time, cutting through the rising murmur of shocked whispers. "I need everyone to stay calm. But there are things in Natalie's basement that the police need to see immediately. I'm not making accusations. I'm just saying what I found when I went to get the emergency seating charts she said were stored down there." My mother grabbed my arm so hard her nails dug through my tuxedo sleeve into skin, and Natalie's father stood up from his seat, looking like he was about to charge across the room and physically remove Trevor from the premises. I stood frozen, trying to process words that made no sense strung together in that order. Trevor was my best friend since college, the guy who'd helped me pick out the engagement ring 6 months ago, who'd thrown my bachelor party 2 weeks back, who'd spent yesterday afternoon helping me tie my bow tie correctly because my hands were shaking too badly to manage it myself. The idea that he would stand up during my wedding reception and say something designed to destroy everything felt like reality fracturing around me. Natalie finally found her voice, and it came out high and strained in a way I'd never heard before. "What are you talking about? What basement? We don't even have a basement." Her face had gone pale beneath her makeup, and I noticed her hands were trembling as she gripped the cake knife she'd been holding when Trevor started speaking. The wedding coordinator rushed over trying to salvage the situation, suggesting we all move this discussion somewhere private, but Trevor shook his head and pulled out his phone. "I took photos," he said. "I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, so I documented everything before coming up here. The police are already on their way because I called them from the parking lot 20 minutes ago." The room erupted in competing conversations as guests tried to make sense of what was happening. Natalie's mother started crying loudly while her father shouted at Trevor to shut his mouth or face a lawsuit for slander. My own father appeared at my side, asking what the hell was going on and whether I knew anything about this basement Trevor kept mentioning. I genuinely had no idea what he was talking about. Natalie and I had been together for 2 years, engaged for 6 months, and I'd been to her townhouse hundreds of times without ever seeing or hearing about any basement. The place was built in the 70s as part of a development that famously had no basements due to the water table issues in our area. Every real estate agent I'd ever spoken to made a point of mentioning that particular detail about properties in that neighborhood. Trevor started swiping through his phone while people shouted questions and accusations at him from every direction. He held up the screen showing a photo of what looked like a wooden door with a heavy padlock, then swiped to show a set of concrete stairs leading down into darkness, then another image of something I couldn't quite make out in the dim lighting. Natalie lunged toward Trevor with a scream that didn't sound human, the cake knife still gripped in her hand. 3 people grabbed her before she could reach him, including one of her bridesmaids and my cousin Danny, who'd been sitting nearby. The knife clattered to the floor, and Natalie collapsed into the arms of the people holding her. Sobbing so hard, her whole body shook. That reaction sent ice through my veins because it looked like guilt or terror or some combination that made Trevor's impossible claims suddenly feel less impossible. My mother demanded to see Trevor's phone, and when he handed it over, her face went gray as she scrolled through the images. She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before and said we needed to get out of this room immediately. The wedding coordinator was on her own phone, presumably calling security or management, and I could hear sirens in the distance getting closer by the second. Natalie's father pushed through the crowd toward Trevor, but my father intercepted him, and the 2 men stood chest to chest having a heated argument I couldn't hear over the general chaos. I finally moved, crossing the ballroom in what felt like slow motion to where Natalie was being held by her bridesmaids and my cousin. Her mascara had run in black streaks down her face and she wouldn't meet my eyes, just kept shaking her head and saying no over and over like a mantra or a prayer. I asked her directly what Trevor was talking about, what was in her basement, why she'd lied about the townhouse not having one. She looked up at me then, and I saw something in her expression that made my stomach drop, a kind of desperate calculation like she was trying to figure out which story would work best. Before she could answer, the ballroom doors burst open, and 4 police officers entered with hands on their weapons, scanning the room for threats. Trevor immediately identified himself as the person who'd called them and started explaining the situation while my wedding descended into complete pandemonium. Guests were filming everything on their phones, some people were trying to leave but being stopped by officers who wanted statements, and the wedding coordinator looked like she might faint from the stress of her perfectly planned event imploding in real time. One of the officers asked Natalie to come speak with them privately, and when she refused to move, they informed her it wasn't really a request. 2 female officers escorted her out of the ballroom while she screamed my name and begged me not to believe whatever lies Trevor was telling. I started to follow, but an officer stopped me, saying they needed to speak with her alone first, and I'd get my turn shortly. Trevor handed over his phone to show the photos he'd taken, and I watched the officers' expressions change as they scrolled through whatever evidence he'd captured. One of them immediately made a radio call requesting additional units and something about a warrant, which sent my heart rate into territory that made my vision tunnel. My mother grabbed my hand and squeezed it so hard both our hands went white, her face a mask of shock and concern. She leaned close and whispered that no matter what happened next, she loved me, and we'd figure this out together, which somehow made everything feel more real and more terrible than anything else that had happened so far. The lead officer, a woman named Sergeant Reyes according to her name badge, asked Trevor to walk them through exactly what he'd found and when. Trevor's voice shook as he explained that Natalie had asked him yesterday to retrieve some backup seating charts from her basement in case there were last-minute changes to the guest arrangements. She'd given him her house key and specific instructions about where to find the access door, which was hidden behind a false wall in her laundry room. He'd thought it was odd at the time, but figured some townhouses had been built differently than others in the development. When he'd opened the door and gone down the stairs, he'd found a finished basement room that looked like it had been set up as some kind of living space, except everything about it was wrong. There was a bed with restraints attached to the frame, a locked cabinet that he hadn't opened, cameras mounted in the corners, and a desk covered in paperwork and files that he'd photographed but not touched. The walls were soundproofed with foam panels, and there was a mini fridge stocked with supplies. He'd taken photos of everything, come back upstairs, locked the house, and driven straight to the police station before heading to the wedding venue. Sergeant Reyes asked why he'd come to the wedding at all instead of staying with the police, and Trevor's voice broke when he answered that he'd hoped he was wrong, that there would be some reasonable explanation that would make sense of what he'd seen. He'd wanted to give Natalie a chance to explain before completely destroying my life. But when he'd arrived at the venue and pulled her aside to ask about it, she'd gone pale and told him to mind his own business, or he'd regret it. That threat had made up his mind to go public rather than wait for the police to potentially let her slip away. I felt like I was floating outside my body watching this happen to someone else, because the Natalie I knew couldn't possibly be connected to whatever Trevor was describing. We'd talked about having kids someday, about growing old together, about building a life based on honesty and trust. The woman I'd proposed to wouldn't have a secret basement with restraints and cameras, and threatening my best friend to keep quiet about it. More police arrived and began cordoning off sections of the ballroom, separating guests into groups for questioning. My father appeared at my side with his lawyer already on speakerphone despite it being a Saturday evening, and I heard fragments of conversation about protecting my interests and not saying anything without legal counsel present. Natalie's parents were being questioned by 2 officers near the exit, her mother still crying while her father gestured angrily and demanded to speak with someone in charge. The wedding photographer stood frozen with her camera lowered, clearly unsure whether to keep documenting this disaster, until one of the officers told her to stop taking photos immediately and surrender her memory cards as potential evidence. 3 of Natalie's bridesmaids huddled together near the cake table looking shell-shocked, while my groomsmen gathered around Trevor asking questions he couldn't or wouldn't answer with police present. The string quartet had packed up and left at some point, and the florist was trying to quietly remove her arrangements before getting dragged into whatever investigation was unfolding. Sergeant Reyes approached me and asked if I'd be willing to answer some questions, and my father's lawyer immediately advised me not to say anything until he arrived in person. But I needed to know what was happening, needed to understand what Trevor had found that was so terrible it justified destroying my wedding day. I asked Reyes directly what evidence they had, what they thought Natalie had done, whether I was in danger or implicated in something I didn't understand. She gave me a long look that seemed to be evaluating how much to tell me, then said they'd found enough in Trevor's photos to justify getting an emergency warrant to search Natalie's property. They couldn't share details of an ongoing investigation, but based on what they'd seen, they had concerns about possible criminal activity that required immediate intervention. She asked if I'd ever been in Natalie's basement or been aware of its existence, and I truthfully said no to both questions. She asked if Natalie had any hobbies or interests that might explain the setup Trevor had photographed, and I had no answer because I couldn't imagine any legal hobby that required restraints and soundproofing. My phone started buzzing with texts and calls from people who'd already left the venue, spreading news of what happened. Social media was exploding with posts from guests who'd filmed the confrontation, and within an hour of Trevor's announcement, hashtags about our wedding were trending locally. My mother tried to shield me from seeing the posts, but it was impossible to avoid as more people sent links and screenshots asking if I was okay and what was really going on. Someone had leaked photos from Trevor's phone to a local news blog that ran the story with a headline about a wedding scandal and possible criminal investigation, complete with my name and Natalie's, despite neither of us having been charged with anything. My father's lawyer finally arrived and immediately tried to get the police to clear the venue and stop treating me like a suspect. But Reyes calmly explained that everyone present was a potential witness and they'd need statements before anyone could leave. The hotel staff looked devastated by the disaster unfolding in their ballroom. and I overheard the manager on the phone with corporate explaining the situation and requesting guidance on handling the media that was surely coming. Natalie was brought back into the ballroom in handcuffs, which sent a fresh wave of shock through the remaining guests. Her white wedding dress was rumpled and stained, her hair had come loose from its elaborate updo, and her face was swollen from crying. She saw me and started shouting that this was all a misunderstanding, that Trevor had misinterpreted what he'd seen, that she could explain everything if they'd just give her a chance. The officers holding her arms kept her moving toward the exit while she begged me to listen to her, to not believe the lies, to remember that we loved each other. I stood frozen, watching the woman I'd been about to marry being led away in handcuffs, and every memory of our relationship started reframing itself through this new terrible lens. Had I ever really known her? Or had I been in love with a carefully constructed performance? The officers took her out a side exit to avoid the media that had gathered at the main entrance, and I watched through the windows as they loaded her into a patrol car, while photographers captured everything from the parking lot perimeter. Sergeant Reyes approached me again with an evidence bag containing Natalie's phone, which they'd confiscated when they arrested her. She asked if I recognized any of the contacts or recent communications, and when I looked at the screen through the plastic bag, I saw names I didn't recognize and conversations that made no sense in context of the person I thought I knew. There were messages about deliveries and payments and someone asking when the next session would be scheduled, all using coded language that seemed designed to avoid direct references to whatever was actually being discussed. Reyes asked if Natalie had ever mentioned having a second income source or side business, and I explained that she worked as a marketing consultant and occasionally took freelance projects, but I'd never seen anything that looked like the messages on her phone. One conversation thread caught my eye, messages to someone saved in her contacts as just the letter V, discussing logistics for something happening the day after our wedding. The timeline made me feel sick because it suggested whatever she was involved in would have continued even after we were married, even after I'd become legally entangled in whatever criminal enterprise she was running. My father pulled me aside and said we needed to leave immediately, that staying here while police questioned everyone would only lead to more photos and speculation. His lawyer agreed, saying I'd cooperated enough and we should go somewhere private to discuss strategy for protecting my reputation and assets. But I couldn't leave without understanding what Trevor had really found, without seeing with my own eyes what had been happening in that basement while I'd been planning our future together. I asked Reyes if I could accompany officers to Natalie's townhouse when they executed the search warrant, and she said absolutely not, that I was too emotionally involved and potentially compromised. She did say that once the scene was processed and photographed, they might be willing to show me sanitized versions of what they'd found, if I could demonstrate a legitimate need to know. My mother argued that I had every right to know what my fiancé had been doing, but the lawyer quickly shut that down by pointing out that legal rights and emotional needs were very different things. We left through a service entrance to avoid media, and I spent the drive to my parents' house in numb silence while my phone continued buzzing with messages I couldn't bring myself to read. My childhood bedroom felt surreal after everything that had happened. I sat on the same bed where I'd slept as a teenager, still wearing my tuxedo because I couldn't find the energy to change, staring at the wall where old posters and photos documented a simpler time. My mother brought tea I didn't drink and sat quietly offering silent support, while my father paced the hallway outside having urgent phone conversations with the lawyer and probably other people in his network who might help control the narrative. Around midnight, Trevor called, and I almost didn't answer, still processing the fact that my best friend had just blown up my life, even if he'd been right to do it. His voice sounded wrecked when I picked up, apologizing over and over while also insisting he'd had no choice once he saw what was in that basement. I asked him to tell me everything he'd found, every detail he could remember, because I needed to understand what I'd almost married into. Trevor took a shaky breath and started describing a space that sounded like something from a nightmare or a crime documentary, nothing like anything I could connect to the woman who'd laughed at my jokes and fallen asleep on my shoulder watching movies. The basement room had been extensively modified from whatever it originally was, Trevor explained. The soundproofing was professional grade, the kind used in recording studios or therapy offices where privacy was essential. The restraints on the bed weren't the novelty kind you'd buy at an adult store, but heavy-duty medical-grade equipment designed to securely hold someone against their will. The cameras in the corners were connected to a computer system with what looked like streaming capabilities, suggesting whatever happened in that room was being recorded or broadcast somewhere. The locked cabinet concerned him most because it was the kind of security furniture used to store controlled substances or weapons, reinforced and requiring both a key and a combination to access. The desk had been covered in paperwork that he'd photographed, but mostly not read, catching glimpses of names and numbers and what might have been financial records. There was a clothing rack with outfits in various sizes, a makeup station with professional lighting, and a shelf of wigs in different styles and colors. Everything about the space suggested planning and ongoing operation, not some one-time mistake or temporary situation. I asked Trevor if he'd seen any indication of who else might be involved or who Natalie was working with, and he said there'd been a calendar on the wall with dates marked in code, appointments scheduled weeks in advance that suggested whatever was happening wasn't spontaneous. He'd seen references to initials rather than full names, meeting times that ran late into the night, and dollar amounts that made no sense for any legitimate business. One document he'd photographed appeared to be some kind of contract or agreement, though he hadn't read it closely enough to understand the terms being outlined. There'd been a small safe built into the wall that he hadn't tried to open, and he'd noticed what looked like a separate entrance to the basement from outside the house, a bulkhead door that would allow someone to come and go without entering through the main residence. The level of sophistication and planning that had gone into creating this space suggested Natalie had been operating whatever business this was for a significant period of time, possibly years before I'd even met her. I hung up with Trevor feeling more confused and horrified than before the call. Nothing he'd described matched any version of reality I could accept, and yet the evidence clearly existed. My phone showed a missed call from Natalie's mother, along with several angry texts accusing me of being part of whatever conspiracy had led to her daughter's arrest, which made no sense given that I was clearly as shocked as everyone else. One of the bridesmaids texted asking if I'd known about the basement, adding that she'd always thought there was something off about Natalie, but couldn't articulate what specifically had bothered her. My college roommate sent a link to a news article already published online with the headline, "Local Wedding Turns into Crime Scene Investigation," complete with photos taken by guests and speculation about what charges Natalie might face. The article quoted anonymous sources, suggesting everything from human trafficking to illegal pornography to financial fraud, all without any actual confirmed information, but generating plenty of attention and shares. Around 2 a.m, Sergeant Reyes called to inform me that they'd executed the search warrant at Natalie's townhouse and found evidence supporting multiple serious charges. She couldn't share specific details yet, but said the investigation was expanding to include possible accomplices and victims who might need to be located and protected. She asked if I'd be available to come to the station in the morning to provide a formal statement and potentially identify people in photographs and videos they'd recovered from the basement. I agreed while feeling sick at the thought of what those videos might contain, then asked if Natalie had said anything about why she'd hidden this from me or what she'd planned to do after we were married. Reyes paused before answering that Natalie was refusing to cooperate without her lawyer present, but had made some statements suggesting she believed I knew nothing about her activities and had been deliberately kept separate from that part of her life. The idea that I'd been nothing more than a cover story or legitimate front for criminal activity made me feel used in ways I couldn't fully process. I finally changed out of my tuxedo around 3, hanging it carefully in the closet, despite knowing I'd never wear it again or be able to look at it without remembering this disaster. My mother knocked softly and came in to sit on the edge of the bed, asking how I was holding up with a level of concern that made me want to cry for the first time since this started. I admitted I had no idea how to process any of this, that every memory of Natalie now felt contaminated by the knowledge of what she'd been hiding. Had she been planning to continue using that basement after we were married, conducting whatever business she ran while I slept upstairs or worked at my office? Had she ever actually loved me? Or had our entire relationship been strategic positioning for some purpose I still didn't understand? My mother said the only thing that mattered now was protecting myself legally and emotionally, that grieving the relationship I thought I had was valid even though it turned out to be built on lies. She promised we'd get through this together, that family support wouldn't waver no matter how ugly things got, which helped slightly, even though the future looked impossibly dark. The next morning brought a fresh onslaught of media attention that my father's lawyer tried to manage with limited success. Every news outlet in the area was running stories about our wedding disaster, and national media was starting to pick up the story as details leaked from the police investigation. Social media had turned us into a trending topic with thousands of people speculating about what Natalie had been doing in that basement and whether I'd been complicit or genuinely oblivious. Someone created a hashtag combining our names that was being used to share theories and supposed insider information, most of it completely fabricated but spreading faster than any corrections could contain. My employer called expressing concern about the negative attention affecting our company's reputation, stopping just short of asking me to take unpaid leave until things settled down. Friends and extended family reached out with messages of support, mixed with obvious curiosity about details I couldn't share even if I knew them. The wedding venue sent an apologetic email about their cancellation and refund policy, which felt absurdly normal given that my wedding had literally ended with my bride being arrested. I drove to the police station that morning with my father and his lawyer flanking me like security, running a gauntlet of reporters shouting questions we didn't answer. Inside, Sergeant Reyes escorted us to a private interview room where she laid out what they'd found in Natalie's basement, in terms sanitized enough to share with a civilian, but detailed enough to make the severity clear. The space had been operating as an illegal medical facility where Natalie performed procedures she wasn't licensed or qualified to do, primarily cosmetic treatments that were either banned in the United States or required proper medical oversight. She'd been advertising her services through encrypted channels online, offering heavily discounted procedures to people desperate enough to accept the risks of underground treatment. The restraints were used to secure patients during procedures. The cameras recorded everything for her protection against potential lawsuits or complaints, and the locked cabinet contained controlled substances and medical equipment she'd acquired through illegal channels. The clients who'd been scheduled in her calendar were people paying cash for treatments they couldn't afford through legitimate providers, many of them undocumented immigrants who feared going to real medical facilities. The revelation hit differently than anything I'd imagined. This wasn't human trafficking or pornography or violent crime, but it was still serious criminal activity with real victims who'd trusted Natalie to safely perform procedures she wasn't qualified to do. Reyes explained that they'd found evidence of at least 30 clients over the past 18 months, some who'd experienced complications requiring emergency room treatment afterward, others who'd filed complaints under fake names that had gone nowhere because they couldn't prove who'd performed the procedures. One woman had suffered permanent nerve damage from a botched injection. Another had developed a serious infection that nearly killed her, and several others had been left with disfiguring results that would require expensive corrective surgery they couldn't afford. Natalie had been collecting thousands of dollars per procedure while operating without insurance, proper training, or any oversight, essentially running a medical practice from her basement while presenting herself as a normal marketing consultant to the rest of the world. I asked how long this had been going on and whether there was any chance I could have known, and Reyes said the evidence suggested Natalie had started her illegal practice at least 3 years ago, meaning she'd been operating it for a full year before we met and throughout our entire relationship. She'd been careful to schedule clients only when I wasn't around, had created elaborate cover stories about her whereabouts when she was actually working in the basement, and had deliberately avoided leaving any evidence in the main part of her house that might tip me off. The separate entrance meant clients never had to come through the front door, and the soundproofing ensured I wouldn't hear anything even if I'd been home during a procedure. Reyes said that based on Natalie's own statements, she'd planned to continue operating after our marriage, perhaps even expand by having me unknowingly provide financial cover for her activities. My legitimate income and professional reputation would have given her more credibility and made investigators less likely to look closely at what she was really doing. The lawyer asked what charges Natalie was facing and what implications that might have for me, and Reyes listed a sobering array: practicing medicine without a license, illegal possession of controlled substances, medical fraud, reckless endangerment, and potentially more as the investigation continued. I wasn't being charged with anything because there was no evidence I'd known about or participated in her activities, but my name was forever linked to hers in public consciousness, and nothing could change that. The lawyer asked about asset protection and whether Natalie had any claims to property or money that were technically mine, starting the process of legal separation that felt premature given we'd never actually gotten married. Reyes said the district attorney's office would likely want to interview me multiple times as they built their case, and I should expect to potentially testify at trial if Natalie didn't take a plea deal. The idea of sitting in a courtroom describing our relationship while prosecutors dissected every detail made me feel sick, but the lawyer said cooperation was my best option for protecting my own interests. Reyes brought in a laptop and asked me to look at photographs recovered from Natalie's computer, warning me that some images were disturbing, but they needed my help identifying people and understanding context. The first photo showed Natalie in medical scrubs standing next to her basement operating table, looking professional and confident in a way that made my skin crawl. Other images showed the space from various angles, documenting the equipment and setup in detail that would be used as evidence at trial. Then came photos of clients in various states of treatment, their faces visible enough for potential identification, and Reyes asked if I recognized anyone. I didn't know any of them personally, though one woman looked vaguely familiar from Natalie's social media, possibly someone she'd mentioned as a work colleague or friend. Reyes made notes about potential leads to pursue, then showed me screenshots of conversations from Natalie's encrypted messaging apps where she'd discussed pricing and procedures in language that was clearly coded, but whose meaning was now obvious in context. One conversation thread that Reyes specifically wanted my opinion on showed Natalie talking with someone identified only as D about expanding operations and bringing in additional providers. The messages suggested this person might have been a partner or supplier, helping Natalie obtain equipment and substances she couldn't legally purchase, possibly someone with medical credentials who was willing to assist for a cut of the profits. Reyes asked if Natalie had ever mentioned anyone with that initial or described having a business partner in any context, and I tried to think through every conversation we'd had about her work. She'd occasionally mentioned collaborating with other marketing consultants on larger projects, but had never introduced me to anyone who might fit this description. One name came to mind, a guy named Dominic, who'd come up a few times as someone she was working with on a long-term contract, but I'd never met him and wasn't sure if he was real or another fabrication she'd created to explain her activities. The interview lasted 3 hours and left me emotionally exhausted from reliving every detail of my relationship with Natalie through the lens of her criminal activities. Reyes thanked me for my cooperation and said she'd be in touch as the investigation progressed, then added almost gently that I should consider speaking with a therapist who specialized in trauma and betrayal. The suggestion felt appropriate given how completely my life had been upended in less than 24 hours, though finding time for therapy seemed impossible when I was drowning in legal meetings and media attention. My father's lawyer walked us through next steps for protecting my assets and reputation, including potential statements to media and strategies for distancing myself from Natalie's crimes without appearing to throw her under the bus in ways that might create civil liability. The calculation required in every decision felt overwhelming, turning what should have been simple emotional processing into a legal minefield where every word mattered. Outside the police station, the media presence had grown rather than diminished, cameras and microphones thrust toward us as reporters shouted questions about whether I'd known, whether I was complicit, whether I felt like a victim or an accomplice. The lawyer had prepared a brief statement that I read in a shaking voice, explaining that I'd had no knowledge of Natalie's illegal activities and was cooperating fully with the investigation and asking for privacy as I dealt with this shocking betrayal. The words felt inadequate to express the complexity of what I was feeling, but anything more detailed would have been picked apart and analyzed by thousands of strangers looking for hidden meanings. We pushed through the crowd to our car, while cameras captured every angle of my face, knowing these images would be attached to articles about this scandal for years to come. My father drove us back to their house while I slumped in the passenger seat, feeling like my entire identity had been shredded and I didn't know who I was anymore beyond that guy whose fiancée turned out to be a criminal. Trevor called again that afternoon, and this time I actually wanted to talk to him despite still processing my complicated feelings about his role in all this. He'd been interviewed by police that morning and given a formal statement about finding the basement, and he said detectives had praised his quick thinking in documenting everything before Natalie could destroy evidence. They'd confirmed that without his intervention, Natalie might have continued operating indefinitely, potentially harming more people who trusted her with procedures she wasn't qualified to perform. I wanted to thank him for stopping her even though the method and timing had been devastating, but the words wouldn't come out right. Instead, I asked if he'd known something was wrong before finding the basement, whether there'd been signs I'd missed that might have helped me see the truth sooner. Trevor admitted he'd always found Natalie slightly cold and calculated, but had dismissed it as personality difference rather than evidence of criminal behavior. He'd never liked how much control she seemed to have over my schedule and friend choices, how she'd gradually isolated me from college friends and redirected my social life toward her preferred circle. That observation hit hard because I hadn't noticed the isolation happening, had genuinely believed I was making normal relationship compromises, rather than being systematically separated from people who might have asked difficult questions. Looking back with clarity I hadn't had before, I could see how Natalie had discouraged me from spending too much time at her place, how she'd always suggested we meet at my apartment or go out rather than staying at her townhouse. I'd thought she was being considerate of my preferences, but really, she'd been protecting her secret by limiting my opportunities to discover the basement. She'd also been strategic about when she scheduled her illegal procedures, apparently checking my calendar to ensure I'd be at work or traveling when clients were coming to her house. The level of planning and deception required to maintain that double life while also managing a full relationship with me suggested capabilities I'd never imagined her having, a kind of compartmentalization that felt sociopathic in its thoroughness. The news cycle continued churning out stories about our wedding disaster, each iteration adding new, speculative details that might or might not be accurate. One tabloid ran a piece claiming Natalie had planned to use our marriage as a way to access my professional network for recruiting new clients, painting me as either naive or complicit, depending on which paragraph you read. Another outlet published interviews with people claiming to have been victimized by Natalie's illegal procedures, though most of those sources remained anonymous due to their own immigration status or fear of legal consequences for having sought illegal treatment. Social media transformed our wedding into a cautionary tale about how well you really know your partner, with relationship experts weighing in on warning signs people should watch for and commenters sharing their own stories of discovering partners' hidden lives. My name was mentioned in virtually every article despite having done nothing wrong, forever linked to Natalie's crimes simply because I'd been unlucky enough to fall in love with the wrong person. My employer finally asked me to take a leave of absence after clients started expressing concern about the negative publicity affecting their own brands. The request was framed as supportive, giving me time to deal with this personal crisis, but the underlying message was clear that my presence was becoming a liability. I agreed to step back for a few weeks, knowing my career had probably just suffered permanent damage regardless of my innocence. My father tried to spin it as an opportunity to regroup and plan my next moves, but we both knew the truth was that I'd become professionally toxic through no fault of my own. Friends from work stopped responding to messages, and I watched in real time as people distanced themselves to avoid being associated with the scandal. Only Trevor and a few other close friends maintained regular contact, while most of my social circle quietly dropped away rather than risk their own reputations by being seen supporting me. Natalie's preliminary hearing happened 3 days after the wedding that wasn't, and I attended despite my lawyer's recommendation to stay away. I needed to see her, to look her in the eye and try to understand how the woman I'd loved could have hidden such a massive part of her life. She was brought into the courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of a white wedding dress, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail rather than the elaborate style she'd had for our ceremony. When our eyes met across the room, she mouthed, "I'm sorry," and tears streamed down her face, but I felt nothing except a kind of hollow curiosity about whether those tears were genuine or another performance. The prosecutor outlined the charges in devastating detail, describing the illegal medical practice and the victims who'd suffered complications from her unqualified treatment. Natalie's lawyer entered a not guilty plea and requested bail, arguing she wasn't a flight risk and had no prior criminal history, but the prosecutor countered that she'd been running a sophisticated criminal enterprise and had the resources to disappear if released. The judge denied bail, citing the severity of charges and number of victims, and ordered Natalie held pending trial. She turned to look at me one more time before being led away, her expression a mixture of pleading and resignation that made me wonder what she'd expected to happen after getting caught. Had she thought I'd stand by her despite everything, that love would somehow overcome the betrayal and criminal activity? Or had she simply never planned for the possibility of being discovered, confident in her ability to compartmentalize and deceive indefinitely? I left the courthouse feeling no closure, just more questions about how I'd been so thoroughly fooled and what that said about my judgment. The lawyer reminded me that I'd need to be prepared for Natalie's defense team potentially trying to implicate me or suggest I'd known more than I was admitting. Standard strategy for desperate defendants looking to spread blame. That possibility added another layer of anxiety to everything else. Knowing my innocence might not be enough if Natalie decided to drag me down with her. The district attorney's office contacted me later that week asking for another interview, this time with multiple prosecutors who were building the case against Natalie. They wanted me to walk through our entire relationship chronologically, identifying moments where she'd been away or secretive that now aligned with her illegal activities. We spent 5 hours reconstructing a timeline that showed Natalie had been operating her basement practice throughout our relationship, with the frequency of procedures actually increasing after we got engaged. The prosecutor suggested she might have seen our upcoming marriage as providing additional cover and legitimacy, making it even less likely that anyone would question what she was really doing. One prosecutor asked if I'd noticed any unexplained money or purchases that might indicate her illegal income, and I had to admit I'd never paid close attention to her finances because we'd maintained separate accounts, and she'd always seemed comfortable financially. That conversation triggered a review of my own financial records to ensure nothing looked suspicious or suggested I'd been receiving money from Natalie's criminal enterprise. The lawyer wanted documentation proving I'd paid for everything myself and had no unusual deposits or transfers that might raise questions. My bank statements showed nothing except my normal salary and expenses, which was a relief, but also somehow made me feel worse about how completely separate our lives had actually been. She'd never needed my money because she was making plenty from her illegal practice, and she'd never tried to combine finances because that would have created a paper trail I might have questioned. Every detail that emerged reinforced how calculated and deliberate her deception had been, how thoroughly she'd constructed a fake version of herself for me to love while her real life happened in that basement. Trevor called with news that police had arrested the person identified as D in Natalie's encrypted messages, a former medical assistant named Dominic Rourke, who'd been supplying her with controlled substances and equipment stolen from his employer. The arrest came after investigators traced shipments documented in Natalie's records and connected them back to Dominic's access at the medical facility where he worked. He was cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing detailed information about the scope of Natalie's operation and identifying other potential victims who hadn't come forward yet. His cooperation meant more evidence piling up against Natalie, making it increasingly unlikely she'd be able to negotiate any kind of favorable plea deal. Trevor said the prosecutors were calling Dominic's testimony a breakthrough in understanding how Natalie had sustained her operation for so long without getting caught, proving she'd had help from someone with legitimate medical access. The media found out about Dominic's arrest and ran stories connecting him to Natalie, speculating about whether they'd been romantically involved in addition to their criminal partnership. The question made me feel sick because it added potential infidelity to the betrayal I was already processing, though in some ways, romantic betrayal seemed almost insignificant compared to the criminal deception. I found myself obsessively reading every article and social media post about the case, unable to look away from the disaster even though each new detail made me feel worse. My therapist, who I'd finally started seeing, said this was a normal response to trauma and betrayal, the need to understand what had happened even when understanding brought pain. She suggested I'd eventually need to stop consuming media coverage to protect my mental health, but acknowledged I wasn't ready for that yet while everything was still actively unfolding. Natalie's family reached out through their lawyer requesting a meeting, and mine advised strongly against it until we knew what they wanted. The request came with accusations that I'd somehow led police to target Natalie or had been involved in setting up whatever Trevor had found in the basement. The absurdity of the accusations would have been laughable if they weren't being made by people who were supposedly going to become my in-laws, people I'd spent holidays with and considered family. My lawyer drafted a response declining the meeting and making clear that I'd been completely unaware of Natalie's activities, that I was cooperating with law enforcement, and that any attempt to implicate me would be met with legal action. The aggressive stance felt necessary to protect myself, even though it meant burning bridges with people I'd once cared about. Another casualty of Natalie's decisions that rippled out, affecting everyone connected to her. 2 months after the wedding disaster, the district attorney announced a grand jury had indicted Natalie on 43 counts, covering her illegal medical practice and its various victims. The number stunned me, even though I'd known the scope was large, translating abstract concepts of harm into a concrete count of people whose lives she'd damaged. The announcement brought another wave of media attention and more stories from victims willing to speak publicly about their experiences. One woman described permanent scarring from a procedure Natalie had botched, explaining she'd trusted her based on convincing fake credentials and a professional website that made the operation seem legitimate. Another man talked about nearly dying from an infection after treatment, spending weeks in the hospital recovering from complications, while Natalie ignored his calls for help. Each story added to my understanding of the real harm she'd caused, moving beyond abstract criminality to the specific suffering of individual people who'd believed her lies. The trial date was set for 6 months out, giving both sides time to prepare their cases and for prosecutors to continue interviewing victims and witnesses. I was told to expect to be called as a witness for the prosecution, required to testify about our relationship, and confirm I'd had no knowledge of Natalie's basement activities. The thought of sitting in a witness box while Natalie watched from the defense table made my stomach turn, but the prosecutors said my testimony would be crucial for establishing her pattern of deception. I'd represent the person closest to her who'd still been completely fooled, demonstrating how effectively she'd compartmentalized and hidden her criminal enterprise, even from someone who should have known her well. The lawyer prepared me for the kinds of questions defense attorneys might ask, attacks on my credibility, or suggestions that I was lying about my ignorance to protect myself from prosecution. During this waiting period, I tried to rebuild some version of a normal life, despite knowing normal was probably impossible now. I returned to work after my leave of absence, facing whispers and awkward silences from colleagues who didn't know how to act around me. Some people were supportively sympathetic, while others clearly believed I must have known something and was either lying or willfully blind to obvious signs. I moved out of my apartment because too many memories of Natalie lived in those rooms, finding a smaller place across town where I could start fresh without constant reminders. My social life contracted to basically just Trevor and a few other loyal friends, everyone else having drifted away or been deliberately cut out as I tried to protect myself from judgment and speculation. Dating felt impossible when my last relationship had exploded so spectacularly publicly, and the idea of trusting anyone enough to get close seemed laughable after being so thoroughly deceived. The months of waiting brought a strange kind of stasis where life continued, but nothing felt real or important. I went through motions of work and daily routine while mentally preparing for trial testimony and emotionally processing the betrayal that had redefined my entire sense of self. Therapy helped me understand that Natalie's deception said nothing about my worth or judgment, that even trained professionals had been fooled by skilled manipulators. But intellectually, understanding something didn't make it hurt less. I grieved the relationship I'd thought I had, while simultaneously feeling stupid for grieving something that had never really existed, at least not in the form I'd believed. Friends assured me I'd eventually move past this and find happiness again. But those promises felt hollow when I couldn't imagine trusting anyone enough to build toward a future together. The trial finally began on a cold morning in November, almost exactly a year after Natalie and I had gotten engaged. The courthouse was packed with media and spectators drawn by the sensational nature of the case, and I had to push through crowds to reach the witness waiting room. Prosecutors had prepared me extensively for my testimony, walking through every likely question and every potential attack the defense might launch. When my name was called, I walked into the courtroom feeling like I was moving through water, everything slowed down and muffled by anxiety. Natalie looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by months in jail and the weight of charges against her, but her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me look away. The prosecutor led me through basic questions about our relationship, establishing timeline and intimacy, and my complete lack of knowledge about her basement activities. Then came cross-examination, where Natalie's defense attorney tried to paint me as either complicit or willfully ignorant, asking how I could have lived with someone for 2 years without noticing anything suspicious. I explained honestly that Natalie had been careful to keep her activities hidden, that she'd had a separate entrance for clients and only operated when I was away, that the soundproofing meant I'd never heard anything unusual. The attorney pushed harder, suggesting I must have benefited financially from her illegal income, or at least suspected something was wrong, but I maintained that our finances had been separate, and I'd never seen any indication of criminal behavior. The questioning felt invasive and accusatory despite my status as a victim of her deception, and I left the witness stand feeling like I'd been on trial rather than testifying against someone else. The experience reinforced how completely Natalie's actions had contaminated every aspect of my life, turning even my attempt to help prosecutors into another form of public humiliation. The trial lasted 3 weeks and produced a steady stream of damning evidence and heartbreaking victim testimony. Medical experts explained how dangerous Natalie's procedures had been and how she'd lacked the training necessary to safely perform them. Victims described their suffering and the permanent damage done by trusting someone who'd seemed credible and professional. Dominic testified about supplying her with stolen substances and equipment, explaining how she'd recruited him and convinced him her operation was a victimless crime helping people who needed affordable care. Each day brought new revelations about the scope of her enterprise and the callousness with which she'd treated people seeking help. By the time both sides rested their cases, there seemed little doubt about the verdict, even though we had to wait for jury deliberations. The jury took only 6 hours to find Natalie guilty on all 43 counts, a verdict that brought relief mixed with sadness for the relationship I'd lost and the person I'd thought I knew. Natalie showed no reaction when the verdict was read, just sat still staring straight ahead while her parents sobbed in the gallery behind her. Sentencing was scheduled for a month later, and prosecutors said they'd be recommending maximum prison time, given the number of victims and severity of harm. I attended the sentencing hearing and listened as victim after victim gave impact statements describing how Natalie's actions had damaged their lives. When the judge finally announced a sentence of 25 years in state prison, Natalie finally broke down crying and tried to turn toward me, but I looked away, unable to give her whatever closure or forgiveness she was seeking. Walking out of that courthouse for the last time, I felt something shift inside me, not healing exactly, but the beginning of acceptance that this chapter of my life was over. Trevor met me on the steps and suggested getting dinner somewhere quiet, giving me space to process the end of a trial that had dominated months of my life. Over the meal, we talked about moving forward and what that might look like after everything that had happened. I'd never get back the time lost to this disaster or fully undo the damage to my reputation, but I could choose how to move forward from here. Trevor reminded me that I'd done nothing wrong, that being deceived by someone didn't make me complicit in their crimes, and that eventually people would remember me as a victim rather than a participant. The words helped, even though I knew the journey toward reclaiming my identity would be long and difficult. 6 months after Natalie's sentencing, I accepted a job offer in a different city, ready for a genuine fresh start where my name wasn't associated with scandal. Trevor helped me pack up my apartment and made the drive with me, talking about new beginnings and leaving the past behind without pretending it hadn't happened. The therapist said starting over wouldn't erase the trauma, but could give me space to heal without constant reminders that geography alone couldn't fix everything, but it was a reasonable step toward rebuilding. In my new city with my new job and apartment where nobody knew my story, I found I could breathe a little easier, could imagine a future that wasn't defined by Natalie's betrayal. I started dating again eventually, slowly and cautiously, learning to trust both others and my own judgment that had been so badly shaken. Life moved forward because it had to, and I moved with it, carrying scars but refusing to let them stop me from building something real and honest. The wedding that ended in disaster became the beginning of understanding who I was without illusions, and that clarity, however painfully acquired, became the foundation for everything that came after. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.